Well, well, they thought you were reachable, didn't they? Thought they could tug at a few carefully placed doubts, arrange a few strategic whispers, and watch you collapse like every other person who mistook noise for authority. People like that always assume you'll break where they would. They confuse your quiet with fear, your restraint with fragility, your composure with surrender. They never once consider the possibility that you've already survived storms stronger than their opinions, that you've already rebuilt yourself from places they never had the courage to enter. They didn't know the architecture of your mind was constructed during nights when your soul had to choose between sinking or shaping itself. They didn't know silence for you isn't emptiness, it's endurance wearing a steady face. So when they launched what they called their final test, it wasn't candles or robes or ancient symbols in any literal sense. It was pressure. A room full of people who believed their titles gave them the right to interpret your soul. It was a chamber made of expectations, a circle built from the assumption that they could predict how you'd respond under scrutiny, a script they wrote without ever meeting the real character. They expected you to play along, to shrink, to seek approval, to fold beneath the weight of their collective gaze. But they miscalculated one detail, the part of you they couldn't decode, the part that doesn't tremble when watched, the part forged from years of being misunderstood, underestimated, misread, the part that learned early that the world will always try to define what it fears or envies. They were testing a version of you that doesn't exist anymore, a ghost of a past self who once believed people saw clearly. You don't live there now. You moved far beyond their vocabulary of control. When you stepped into their so-called chamber, the psychological one, not the theatrical one, it wasn't the room that grew silent, it was them. Something in the way you held yourself made even their confidence reconsider its posture. The air tightened, not because of intimidation, but because truth rearranges space in subtle ways. They wanted a reaction. You gave them reflection. They wanted chaos. You gave them clarity. They wanted to pull you off balance, but your presence made their own equilibrium unstable. You didn't speak at first. You didn't need to. People who operate from insecurity interpret silence as threat. People who operate from power interpret silence as composure. The ones before you didn't know which one you held. And uncertainty is the sharpest blade in a room, built on assumed dominance. Their questions weren't really questions. They were traps wrapped in sophistication. Attempts to analyze your intentions, your history, your emotional pulse. But with each answer, measured, calm, deliberate, you dismantled their assumptions. You weren't playing defense. You were walking through their structure, seeing the weak beams and hollow foundations they hid behind performance. You read them quicker than they read the script they rehearsed. One of them leaned forward, trying to provoke. You could feel the insecurity behind the challenge. Another pretended neutrality, but the tapping of his finger betrayed impatience. A third shifted in her seat every time you made eye contact, as if confronting her own reflection instead of your presence. They weren't evaluating you. They were being exposed by you. Their projections, their fears, their illusions, all dissolving in real time. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't assert anything. You simply answered with a self-awareness so rooted, their hierarchy felt irrelevant. That's the thing about old systems. They panic when someone moves without seeking permission. Their entire architecture relies on people believing the structure defines them. But you walked in already defined. They wanted to see cracks. You showed them clarity. They wanted to find weaknesses. You made them confront their own. They wanted to test your resolve. You revealed their doubt. Their so-called test was never about your strength. It was about defending their illusion of control. They needed to believe they could regulate who rises, who stays small, who bends. They wanted to confirm that your growth was luck, not discipline. that your presence was coincidence, not consequence, that your evolution was an accident, not intention. But the longer you spoke, the more their confidence thinned. They searched for faults and found mirrors instead. Mirrors that showed them how much of their authority was costume, how much of their pride was performance, how much of their knowledge was repetition. They realized, slowly, painfully, that the person they tried to dissect had already outgrown the language of their measurement. What they felt wasn't fear, it was misalignment, like standing in a room designed for smaller souls while someone of full size walked in. The walls didn't shrink, their self-image did. They tried to project judgment, but judgment ricocheted. They tried to analyze you, but analysis reversed polarity. You didn't resist, you reflected. And reflection is the one thing egos cannot withstand. Their questions became softer, their tones more controlled, their eyes less steady. They weren't interviewing you anymore. They were studying themselves through you. And the discomfort was palpable. Every time you answered, a silent truth surfaced. They weren't qualified to evaluate someone who'd rebuilt themselves from depths they never walked. In their world, power is inherited through positions. In yours, power is earned in silence when no one applauds. That difference is what cracked their composure. You could see it in the way their posture faltered, their brows furrowed, their certainty dissolved. They wanted dominance, but were handed discomfort. They wanted confirmation, but were met with contradiction. They wanted superiority, but were shown transparency. They thought the final test would break you. Instead, it broke their illusion. Because you weren't fighting their questions, you were illuminating them. Every answer exposed the imbalance. Every breath challenged hierarchy. Every moment of stillness destabilized their assumptions. Not through force, but through integrity. Not through defiance, but through presence. Even the so-called leader, the one who believed he held the highest psychological leverage, shifted in his seat when your gaze landed on him. He expected to feel superior. He felt observed. He expected to feel control. He felt transparent. He expected a challenger. He met a mirror. You didn't argue. You didn't compete. You didn't even try to prove anything. That's what shook them most. They're accustomed to people performing under pressure, scrambling to impress or survive. But you didn't scramble. You simply existed. And existence, when purified, becomes its own authority. That's when the atmosphere shifted, not physically, psychologically. You could feel the room recalibrating around you, not because you demanded it, but because truth naturally becomes center of gravity. Their questions slowed, their voices softened. Their eyes carried a new weight, a mix of uncertainty, curiosity, and something dangerously close to respect. One woman whispered to the man beside her, not realizing she spoke loud enough for you to hear. "They don't react like the others." Another scribbled notes with trembling hands. "Not about your answers, about your composure." The leader cleared his throat twice before speaking again, a subconscious admission that his previous confidence had cracked. You didn't gloat, you didn't revel in it, because your power has never been about domination. It's about understanding. And you understood something they didn't. Tests only work when the participant accepts the premise. You never accepted it. You walked in aware that the entire examination was built on insecurity disguised as authority. They weren't evaluating you. They were seeking reassurance that the world still followed their rules. But you were walking proof that it didn't. And that realization, quiet, heavy, undeniable, is what made the room feel suddenly too small for them. It wasn't your rise that intimidated them. It was the revelation that their hierarchy wasn't as high as they believed. They weren't testing your limits. They were confronting theirs. And deep down, they felt it. That's why the room grew quieter. That's why the discussion lost its sharpness. That's why the leader refused to meet your eyes for longer than a second. Because you weren't the one being measured anymore. They were. And somewhere in that silence, they realized a truth they weren't prepared to face. You had already passed the test before they even designed it. Not because you outperformed their expectations, but because you evolved beyond their framework. They called it the final test. At least that's what they liked to pretend it was. A performance, a stage, a symbolic ceremony dressed in seriousness. A group of people standing in a room trying to look like authority, wearing expressions heavy enough to be mistaken for wisdom. They arranged the chairs in a circle, dimmed the lights for ambiance, lowered their voices for effect, and waited for you to break. Not physically. No, they'd never risk something so obvious. They wanted to watch your composure fold, your self-belief flicker, your confidence waver. Their entire architecture relied on that. The illusion that they were higher, older, stronger, more in control than you. But the moment you walked in, the atmosphere shifted. Not with power. Power is loud. This was with presence, a quiet gravity that made their structure feel ridiculous. They wanted you to feel small. Instead, the room felt small around you. They misread everything about you. They thought pressure would unravel you, that silence would destabilize you, that the weight of their collective gaze would expose some hidden crack in your identity. But you've been under worse pressure than this. You've survived rooms designed not to test you, but to erase you. You've endured moments where the emotional floor vanished beneath your feet, where you had to rebuild yourself from memory. Compared to all that, their symbolic ceremony felt like children staging a storm with flashlights and sound effects, hoping lightning would appear. They wrote your name on their internal logs with trembling hands, not because they feared you, but because they feared what your existence implied. You were the anomaly their system didn't prepare for. They measured people by predictability, and you refused to be one of their equations. They tried to interpret your silence as hesitation. But your silence wasn't hesitation, it was evaluation. Every symbolic test they presented was just another outdated strategy. Each question, a recycled method of trying to provoke doubt. They assumed you'd answer defensively, nervously, anxiously. Instead, you answered with the steady clarity of someone who stopped seeking validation long ago. And that's when the unease started. One of them shifted in his chair, trying to disguise discomfort as posture adjustment. Another tapped a pen against a notebook, pretending to take notes, but really just trying to release the pressure in his chest. Their leader glanced around the room without moving his head, trying to gauge whether the others noticed what he noticed, that you weren't losing alignment under their scrutiny. No matter how many symbolic hoops they lifted, you stepped through them without losing rhythm. They couldn't understand it. They're used to people adapting, shrinking, performing, adjusting their spine to fit into the shape of approval. They're used to confidence that fractures the moment the room tilts. But you didn't tilt. You didn't swallow your voice. You didn't flinch when they tried to build tension through silence. Instead, you became the silence, the kind that's not empty, but full. The kind that exposes the noise in everyone else. That's when their symbolic hierarchy began to crack. Not physically, but emotionally. These were people who built entire careers around controlling narratives. But your presence made it impossible for them to stick to the script. Their carefully constructed authority felt flimsy around someone whose identity wasn't up for negotiation. You didn't need their approval. And in their world, someone who doesn't need approval is the most destabilizing force imaginable. They ask the same questions they ask every candidate, expecting the same predictable responses. Instead, you gave answers that weren't rehearsed or cautious. They were real. They weren't prepared for someone who wasn't playing the game. Your authenticity became their psychological earthquake. You could see it in the way their expressions hollowed, in the way their posture stiffened, in the way they suddenly couldn't maintain eye contact. For a group that prided itself on reading people, they couldn't read you. You weren't operating on the level they designed. You were operating above it, not in superiority, but in clarity. Clarity has a way of unsettling those who build systems on fog. The leader finally leaned forward, steepling his fingers, like a man taught to imitate gravitas. He asked a question meant to destabilize you, meant to corner you emotionally. But when you responded, something shifted in his face. His confidence flickered, not because you challenged him, but because you didn't let his question define you. You answered from a place deeper than their framework allowed, and for the first time, he realized their symbolic tests weren't measuring you. They were revealing them. You didn't expose weakness. You exposed misalignment. Their entire evaluation process was built on assumptions about how people break under pressure. But you weren't breaking. You were dissecting the architecture of their test in real time. You were seeing the emotional wires behind their symbolic machinery. And the more you saw, the less power it held. One of them shifted his chair back a fraction of an inch. Another crossed her arms, not out of confidence, but protection. The room wasn't testing you anymore. It was reacting to you. You weren't resisting their pressure. You were redefining the atmosphere. That's when the symbolic mirrors began to crack, not literally, but psychologically. Their questions turned inward. Their voices lowered. Their confidence faltered. Because when someone walks into a structure built on illusion and refuses to believe in the illusion collapses. Authority only works when the people beneath it agree to feel beneath it. You didn't agree. You didn't posture. You didn't challenge. You simply didn't shrink. And that alone disrupted their hierarchy more than any dramatic confrontation could have. They expected you to be intimidated by their titles, their tone, their symbolic robes, the professional masks they used to elevate themselves above others. But your presence stripped all of it down to what it really was: performance. People who depend on performance lose power around those who depend on presence. A subtle tension filled the room. Not fear. Fear is loud. This was recognition. The kind that arrives when someone realizes the narrative is slipping out of their hands. They had prepared for resistance, rebellion, even emotional collapse. But they weren't prepared for composure, so steady it felt like reflection. And reflection is the one thing people in power avoid. Because reflection shows who they actually are, not who they pretend to be. You became that reflection. Not aggressively, not intentionally. Simply by being fully yourself in a room that expected you to fold into an approximation of yourself. One of the evaluators exhaled too deeply, betraying stress. Another pinched the bridge of her nose, trying to recover composure without being obvious. The leader swallowed hard before asking his next question. Their system wasn't cracking. It was unraveling. Your presence didn't just disrupt their test, it recalibrated the whole dynamic. The room was no longer examining you. It was recalibrating itself around you. Not because you demanded it, but because that's what happens when authenticity enters a space built on performance. You didn't pass their test. The test dissolved around you. Their symbolic metrics couldn't measure someone who refused to be measured. Their hierarchy couldn't contain someone whose self-worth wasn't sourced externally. And deep down, they knew it. That's why their confidence drained quietly, methodically, like air slipping out of a balloon. They kept glancing at one another, searching for reassurance they couldn't find. Because for the first time, the hierarchy they built wasn't evaluating. It was being evaluated. By presence, not power. by truth, not theatrics. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. They stopped pretending. Their questions softened. Their voices trembled. Their masks slipped. The leader leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing. Not an accusation, but revelation. He finally understood what the others were too afraid to admit. You weren't there to prove yourself. You were there to reveal them. And what you revealed was simple. Their authority wasn't rooted in strength. It was rooted in assumption. You didn't break their system. You outgrew it. And there is nothing more threatening to an old structure than someone who refuses to be shaped by it. And that's when the room fell completely still. Not silent. Still. The kind of stillness that happens when everyone realizes the script they rehearsed no longer applies. They had spent years perfecting these symbolic examinations, these psychological mazes designed to make people doubt themselves just enough to become compliant. But you didn't walk into their maze. You walked through it. Not faster, not stronger, just clearer. Clarity defeats complexity every time. The leader's eyes drifted downward, as if searching the floor for the authority he suddenly couldn't locate. The others followed, shifting, avoiding your gaze, avoiding each other's. They weren't looking at you anymore. They were looking at themselves, and they didn't like what they saw. That's what truth does. It removes the costumes people stitch to their egos and forces them to confront whatever remains. You didn't fight them. You didn't argue. You didn't prove anything. You simply existed in a way that made their old frameworks irrelevant. And irrelevance is the one outcome people in power can't survive. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they ran out of questions, but because they ran out of narrative. Their system had no instructions for what to do when someone didn't bend, didn't break, didn't shrink. Their entire hierarchy was built on the assumption that people would trade authenticity for acceptance. But you didn't. And that's when they realized the test wasn't evaluating you. It was exposing them. The leader finally exhaled, a slow surrender blooming across his face. It wasn't defeat, it was recognition. A quiet understanding that authority built on illusion collapses the moment someone stops believing in it. You were the reminder. Not loud, not defiant, just undeniable. You didn't dethrone anyone. You didn't challenge the room. You simply revealed that their throne had been empty the entire time. And once truth is seen, it can't be unseen. They will return to their structures, their meetings, their symbolic rituals, but nothing will function the way it did before. Because once someone encounters genuine self-awareness, every imitation feels counterfeit. That is your impact, not destruction, disruption, not rebellion, realignment. You didn't rise to their level. You rose beyond it. And that's the part they'll remember, the part they'll whisper about, the part they'll try and fail to replicate. Because some people don't ascend. They return to who they always were, and you just did.